Aiton couldn't help it. After all of the false visions, reality and delusion were too hard to separate. He stretched a hand out to touch the dragonette in front of him. Before he could reach her roughly tanned leather jacket, she knocked his hand aside. The swat was accompanied by what he could only assume was a hissed curse, followed by a stream of incomprehensible gibberish. What? Her eyes narrowed as she looked down at him. She towered over him just like most dragonettes. His horns only came up to a little above her chin. She said something, more slowly this time. The words, they sounded wrong. He thought he could recognize a few sounds, little bits here and there, but they were sharper than he was used to, punctuated by the odd clack as she snapped her jaws. I don't understand. Her glare made it clear that she thought he was some kind of idiot. One hand shot out and grabbed Aiton's wrist in an iron grip, and she dragged him towards the edge of the cliff. For a terrifying moment, Aiton thought that she was going to hurl him off the edge. The way his life had gone, it wouldn't have surprised him for an instant. But she stopped just short and gestured to the burning forest below. He might not have been able to understand the words that followed, but the flat stare that came after made the question clear. Yeah, that was me, he admitted sheepishly. Well, me and Phelan. Mostly Phelan. He's a dragon. Aiton realized he probably wasn't making sense to the other dragonette, but to his surprise, her expression changed. Her eye ridges furrowed and ears flicked as she said something that was very close to, Dragon? Yeah, he's... At that moment, a roar echoed through the canyon. Phelan erupted from the smoke and flames. His sides were heaving, and his red scales were stained dark with smoke. Nonetheless, he struck a formidable sight as he roared, Aiton! Up here! The dragon snapped his head up to see Aiton waving from high above. You are alive! His response sounded a touch incredulous, like he couldn't quite believe the young dragonette had survived. Aiton chose to ignore that as he yelled back, There were two of them, on the cliffs, but I got one and... He trailed off. The newcomer had backed off, out of sight of the dragon, in the canyon below. He was about to pull her forward, when Phelan shouted a warning. Aiton, look out! He had ducked and rolled to the side, just as a pair of shadows swooped overhead. They belonged to two more dragonettes who landed alongside the first, amidst unintelligible shouted words. When he saw that they weren't threatening him, Aiton relaxed. It's fine, they're... friendly, I think? On closer inspection, the trio in question weren't quite cowering, but they didn't seem very interested in approaching the cliff edge. Even when he motioned for them to come closer, they remained where they were. All three were wearing roughly tanned hides, although they seemed to be well made. Soft fur peeked out from the necklines and sleeves. It looked a lot warmer than the ill-fitting coat he wore. The one who had saved him was hissing frantically to the other two, gesturing at Aiton, the delirium corpses, and finally down towards Phelan in the valley below. She was taller than her companions, although not by much. Or maybe she was. Her horns curved back quickly compared to most, masking her true height. Both had simple copper bands encircling their bases, something that reminded Aiton of how his sister Lynn wore her huntress rank. Of the other two, one seemed to be older, maybe in her 40s or 50s. Her left ear was notched just above where a large gold ring hung, and she looked to have been through her share of fights. The worst of her damage was the wide, pale scar in the membrane of her left wing. Nonetheless, she looked healthy enough, and when she interrupted the first dragonette, the tone of command was obvious, even through the language barrier. The youngest, and presumably most junior, gestured with her flint-tipped spear. Her lack of adornments may have been another sign of her rank, or maybe her family just wasn't as wealthy as the others. She was smaller, too, the closest of the three to Aiton's height, and with a slightly stocky, almost masculine build. They all carried bows and quivers of arrows, although their bows looked strange on closer inspection. They were simple wooden shortbows, hatchling's toys, really, with far less power than his own laminated composite bow. It's no wonder her first hit didn't seem to do much more than piss the delirium off. My arrow crippled the first one, and I couldn't even draw it all the way back. It's not like my bow is much bigger than hers. But if they swapped out their weapons for less archaic types, and replaced their leather armor with enameled plates, they would be indistinguishable from a group of huntresses. Aiton figured that was probably exactly what they were.
"What is happening up there?"
Phelan's shouted question made all three huntresses flinch. Aiton just poked his head over the edge and called back, "I'm trying to figure that out. Give me a moment." Taking a deep breath, he pulled himself straight and walked deliberately towards the trio of dragonettes. Deciding to address the first one to arrive, he said, "Thank you for saving me." Knowing she probably wouldn't understand a word he was saying, he pointed back and forth from the distant Delirian's corpse to her, then back to himself and bobbed his head repeatedly. After a moment of confusion, she nodded and smiled, hesitantly. A part of Aiton noted that one of her front teeth appeared to be missing, but he made himself focus on her words. They were brief and had the feel of a "you're welcome," so he made a mental note of them. Then she pointed to herself and said, slowly and clearly, "Rena." "Rena," Aiton repeated, pointing to her. She nodded and her smile widened. He felt his own growing to match, as he pointed to himself. "Aiton." "Tin. No, Aiton," he said, emphasizing the first syllable. "Aiton." At his nod, she pointed to the other two dragonettes. The leader was apparently Atali, while the junior member of the group went by Ness. Then she pointed down towards the canyon. "Dragon?" "Yes, Phelan is a dragon. Phelan. Dragon." That prompted a quick round of muttering between the three before Atali spoke up. "Dragon Phelan," followed by more words that he couldn't understand. "Yeah, he's kind of intimidating, but Phelan is really great when you get to know him."
"I am also still waiting," came the call from down below.
"Right, There really was no reason they had to have this conversation up here. Aiton gestured at the three huntresses, then down at the canyon floor, as he said, "I'm going down there. You meet me." Putting action to words, he started climbing down the cliff. Without a need to hurry, he took his time, carefully choosing each hand and foothold. It wouldn't do to survive everything else, only to crack his head open at the bottom of a cliff. Not to mention how embarrassing it would be. Aiton Luffin escaped from brigands, killed a Delirian, and died of a fall. Up above, the three dragonettes were looking between Aiton and Phelan and then each other, chattering in low voices. They finally cut off when he was about halfway down, but instead of flying, Rena got down and gingerly began to climb. "No!" Aiton shouted. He had no idea why she was climbing, when he knew for a fact that her wings were fully functional. Rena stopped, looking uncertain. The meaning of the word had apparently come across. "No?" It had an odd accent, but was definitely recognizable, as was her sharp gesture at him, then herself. "Just fly down." Of course, that didn't mean anything to her. She just flicked her ears and furrowed her eye ridges. In frustration, Aiton extended his own wings, the long gashes clear for her to see. "I can't fly," he said. He took a hand off the wall long enough to point to himself. "Fly." He gave his wings a flap that sent a jolt of pain through the wounds. "No." He shook his head. When she still didn't move, he pointed to her and said, "You fly." Finally, the message seemed to get through. Hesitantly, she spread her wings. When Aiton nodded vigorously, she pushed off the cliff to glide gracefully towards the ground below. After a few moments, the other two followed her lead. They were waiting for him when he finally reached the canyon floor. Aiton motioned for them to follow him towards where Phelan waited. They did, although they stopped well short of the dragon, apparently reluctant to get any closer. That wasn't Aiton's first concern. He was consumed with concern at how bad his friend looked. Reds were resistant to fire, but Phelan had charged into the depths of an inferno. He was singed all over. Where patches of scales were missing from earlier wounds, blue-tinged ichor dribbled out of burn blisters, and the edge of his remaining wing had patches of membrane that were shriveled and discolored. "How are you doing?" Aiton asked. He sniffed and wrinkled his snout as he sat on a nearby rock. The dragon reeked of wood smoke.
"I will live. It was bad."
He shivered slightly, a tremor travelling from nose to tail tip.
But it could have been far worse.
Not much. There were two of them. I think they were both focused on you. That elicited a slow nod from the dragon.
Likely a mated pair. And you killed them?
Aiden shrugged slightly. One of them. Rena got the other. He motioned towards the dragonette in question. She was with her companions, well back from the dragon, and watching with rapt attention. When Phelan turned his gaze their way, they all seemed to shrink back a bit. Not in a cower, but the dragon's attention definitely made them uncomfortable in some way. Even when he gave a deep nod, they stayed silent and still, until he returned to his conversation with Aiden.
I might have guessed there would be wildlings this far out on the frontier. How did you find them?
Aiden just gestured at the forest fire, still burning behind them. It was wet enough that the blaze wasn't spreading much, but the cloud of dense smoke would be visible for most of an hour's flight to anyone who was bothering to look.
I see. Do you know where they came from?
The dragonette shook his head. We don't even speak the same language.
Unfortunate. It means they likely do not have contact with a civilized group. They would have picked up a few words at least, had that been the case.
Aiden hadn't even considered that. To be fair, he had just been happy to find somebody else, anybody else, on this god's-forsaken island. Wildlings might not have been his first choice for neighbours, but they were far better than brigands. The uncivilized dragonettes beyond the frontiers of the kingdom's control weren't exactly legends, but they tended to keep to themselves. Aiden knew that traders and explorers occasionally interacted with them, along with keeps on the very edges of the frontier. I don't suppose you can speak their language? Aiden ventured.
No, Phelan replied. We encountered them a handful of times, but gestures and pointing were enough to trade. Even so, I doubt these speak the same language as the others I met.
It was hard to imagine what a bunch of wildlings could have to interest a group like Phelan's, so Aiden asked, What did you trade?
Mostly furs and meat for iron tools. One group had rough gold jewelry, for that we traded steel knives. But it would not have been worthwhile, save for how highly they valued our metals.
Aiden gave the trio a once-over. Sure enough, their weapons all appeared to be wood and stone, and aside from Attalie's gold earring and the copper band around the base of Rena's horns, they didn't have any visible metal on them. Do you think we can get one of them to fly to another island and get help? We have plenty in the cache to trade.
Phelan looked doubtful. Perhaps they could carry a message, and perhaps they might even be able to find a settlement. What then? There are no soldiers this far out, and odds are good that it will be spring before another trader arrives. By then, Xantha and the rest will have come and gone.
But Aiden stopped himself before he could mention rescue. He isn't getting off this island. He coughed slightly to cover the slip, and hunted for something else to say. But we should still go get to the cache. It's not far, right?
Not far at all.
Phelan craned his neck to catch a glimpse of the sun as it dipped below the cliff edge.
I admit that I do not recall exactly how far it is, but I cannot see us arriving after dusk.
Then let's go. Aiden tried to lever himself to his feet, but nearly stumbled. His magic wasn't enough to compensate for the sudden weakness in his legs.
Are you all right?
Phelan looked at the dragonette over with some concern. His spear was over where he had left it by the canyon wall. Aiden's steps became more sure as he approached it, but he still heaved a sigh of relief as he picked it up and leaned against it. I think the last few days are catching up to me. Just tired. And hungry, he added, as his stomach rumbled. They both glanced to where the bundles of food and other supplies sat, a bit further up the canyon. Several hard days of cross-country hiking had depleted them somewhat, but there was still plenty.
We eat first, Phelan declared.
After a pause, he added,
And invite our new friends to join us as well.
As the dragon rose and made his way to the food, Aiden strode gingerly over to the group of wildling huntresses. The spear helped a lot, but his legs felt like all the muscles had been replaced with waterlogged rope. They eyed him with odd expressions as he approached. This time it was Attalie who stepped out to meet him. She said something in her language, pointing between him and Phelan, then gesturing to the sky and her wings. No, we can't fly, Aiden confirmed. Or at least he thought he was answering the question. He flapped his wings a little, and shook his head vigorously while using the wildling word for no. Attalie frowned slightly, but seemed to get the message. Aiden took that as a good sign as he motioned for the three to follow. We're about to eat. Food. He mimed putting something into his mouth and chewing. "Thank you," he added, looking pointedly at Rena. Sure enough, she seemed to remember the phrase. "Thank you," she echoed, in an understandable if thick accent, then added something in her own language. Aiton thought for a moment and repeated the phrase. That earned him a smile and what he remembered as, "You're welcome," in the wildling tongue. "Yes, no, thank you, you're welcome. I'm making progress." They followed him to the remainder of their supplies, although they were still reluctant to approach Phelan. He was rather intimidating, even burned and missing a wing. Aiton figured that they would get used to him in time. The trio didn't exactly look pleased with the chunks of meat that Aiton handed them. At least in the process, he managed to pick up the words for meat, food, and water. He certainly did not learn the one for tasty. Rena, in particular, looked disgusted with the piece of tough, unseasoned Tyrox she had been handed. Athalie noticed her expression and said something that sounded like a rebuke. That got the junior huntress to at least take a bite. She didn't exactly seem to be enjoying it. There were still plenty of apples. They had even sweetened slightly since their harvest. Aiton rummaged through the bags until he found some and presented them to the huntresses. It got a reaction, but not the one he had been expecting. Rena laid into him with such vehemence that Aiton took an involuntary step back. He didn't have to understand a word she was saying to know she was furious at him specifically, although he had no idea why. His only clue was one often repeated word that sounded suspiciously like apple. There was a noise from behind, and Rena cut off mid-word. Aiton turned to see Phelan looming over him and looking down at the angry wildling. Athalie practically leapt to her feet and grabbed her subordinate by the shoulders. She hissed something into the other dragonette's ear before bowing to Phelan. "Dragon Phelan" and "Rena" were the only words Aiton caught, but it was clearly an apology of some sort. A moment later, Rena meekly bowed her head and muttered something that sounded contrite. "That seems a little excessive," Aiton commented. "It's not like dragons eat people." Phelan snorted slightly.
"I do not expect any dragons make their home here. Recall what you thought when you met me as a youngling."
Ah, good point. At least he had known that dragons didn't usually go around using their breath weapons on people who didn't deserve it. Maybe you can, The dragon fixed the wildlings with a stare and nodded gravely, then went back to his food. For their part, the trio seemed to take that as an apology accepted. Once Phelan's attention was no longer on them, they returned to nibbling at their food, although they were much more subdued about the complaints. "I think we might have stolen their apples," Aiton whispered, as he went to cut more meat for Phelan. A quick glance showed the huntresses all casting surreptitious looks at him and muttering among themselves.
"Indeed,"
Phelan replied, around a mouthful of Tyrox. "That keep must have been abandoned for decades. I bet the wildlings raided it when they left, and kept up the orchard afterwards."
"Or they may be the reason that the original keep dwellers left."
Aiton blinked, and checked his instinctive reaction to glance back at the wildlings. "Do you really think so?" A draconic shrug was his response.
"Who can say? But remain on your guard. They helped us, yes, but their motivations are their own. Always keep that in mind."
The two lapsed into silence after that, and Aiton recalled the last time that someone had hidden their true intentions. Believing Xantha was a mistake that he resolved to never repeat again.